ever heard a piece of music that seemed to recognise something in you before you found words for it? Perhaps it was a moment of longing, a half-forgotten memory, or simply that sense that time was passing and carrying some part of your life with it. Music can enter those interior spaces that ordinary language struggles to reach. A melody gathers feeling into form. It holds sorrow and joy. It holds memory and hope. And all of these together, allowing us to hear something that we may have sensed without fully understanding. Welcome to Wednesday Wandering with me, Cate Field. Wondering about things that are fascinating and interesting and spiritual and intriguing, and not just me wandering off. I am so pleased you are here. Thank you. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, in my little bit of southwest England in late August, we have a distinct quality of light. The fierce clarity of midsummer softens a little into amber, and the heat of the day remains, and the evenings are still light. My friends in the Southern Hemisphere experience a year turning to spring, with new life beginning to stir. But wherever we live, the seasons remind us that time is always moving through us as well as around us. And in this August week, two figures from very, very different centuries invite us to consider the value of the interior life. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the 12th century Cistercian abbot and mystic, whose feast day falls on the 20th of August, and Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, the 19th century composer and pianist. Bernard gave form to interior experience through prayer and the theological language. Fanny gave it rhythm, harmony, and the passing months of the year. Both understood that the inner life requires attention. It can easily become scattered through activity, through responsibility, and the continual demands of other people. But to remain inwardly alive, we need ways of returning to ourselves. For Bernard, that took place through contemplation. He was born in France in 1090. Bernard entered the monastery of Cîteaux as a young man, and in 1115, when he was about 25, he was sent to establish a new monastery in the wooded valley of Clairvaux in Champagne. The Cistercian life was built around simplicity and prayer and physical work and the regular rhythm of a monastic day. Bernard encouraged sobriety in food, clothing, and buildings, as well as practical care for the poor. Yet his own life soon became remarkably busy. The community at Clairvaux grew rapidly. New monasteries were founded, and Bernard became one of the most influential churchmen in Europe. He travelled, he advised popes, he corresponded with people from every level of society, and he became involved in the religious and political controversies of the time. And this makes his insistence upon contemplation especially compelling, I think. Bernard was familiar with the pressure of activity and the danger of becoming consumed by it. In De Consideratione, written for Pope Eugene III, a former monk of Clairvaux, Bernard warned against allowing constant occupations to produce what he called a hardness of heart. He urged the Pope to consider where his endless responsibilities might lead if he continued to lose himself in them without leaving anything for yourself to yourself. These words were addressed to a pope in the 12th century, yet they feel startlingly contemporary, don't they? Many women become accustomed to living in a state of almost permanent availability. There's always someone to help. There's always something to organise, a message to answer, a problem to solve, a task that appears more urgent than the quiet needs of the soul. Generosity is a beautiful quality. Yet, a life of continual dispersal can leave us strangely absent from ourselves. And Bernard believed that contemplation restored a person to an inner centre. Prayer creates a space in which the scattered parts of the self can be gathered together in the presence of God. His spiritual writing is deeply concerned with love. Pope Benedict XVI described love as the greatest strength of the spiritual life. For Bernard, observing that the saints' writings carry the echo of a rich interior experience. Bernard's most celebrated works include his 86 sermons on the Song of Songs, one of the most lyrical and enigmatic books of the Bible. The Song of Songs speaks in the language of human desire. It's filled with gardens and vineyards and fragrance and smells and absence and the ardent search for the beloved. Bernard interpreted this imagery through the love between God and the human soul. For him, love was a way of knowing. Theology could speak about the divine through reason and argument. Prayer allowed the soul to enter into a relationship. And Bernard believed that intellectual understanding must be nourished by scripture, by contemplation, and by the lived encounter. And this approach has sometimes been called a theology of the heart. In Bernard's writing, the longing for God is never treated as an embarrassment or as a weakness. Desire becomes a sign that the soul is reaching beyond its present limits. 7 centuries later, in a very different setting, Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel was giving musical form to her own interior world. Fanny was born in Hamburg in 1805, and she grew up in a wealthy, highly educated family in Berlin. She and her younger brother Felix displayed exceptional musical ability from childhood, and they studied with many of the same teachers. And Fanny became an outstanding pianist and a composer and a musical advisor to her brother. Felix valued her judgment deeply. He often sent new compositions to her for her criticism and responded seriously to her suggestions and advice. Yet the futures imagined for the two children were very different. When Fanny was 14, her father wrote that music might become Felix's profession, while for her it can and must only be an ornament. That sentence contains an entire world of expectation, doesn't it? Fanny was permitted to be brilliant. She could study, she could perform and compose. Her gifts were admired within the family circle. Public ambition, professional recognition, and authorship remained associated with her brother. Fanny continued to compose. Eventually, she created a musical life within the space available to her. From 1831, she directed a remarkable series of Sunday concerts in the Mendelssohn family home in Berlin. These gatherings often took place in the garden room, the Gartensaal. They brought together professional musicians, writers, intellectuals, and members of Berlin society. Fanny programmed and conducted substantial works by Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, and her brother Felix, alongside her own compositions. The garden room became a serious cultural space under her direction. There is a temptation, I think, to imagine these concerts as charming family entertainments, elegant guests, sunlight streaming through the windows, and a little music before tea. In reality, Fanny was creating and directing something close to her own musical institution. She took the domestic space that she could command and she enlarged its possibilities. Still, The boundary between private accomplishment and public recognition remained real. Fanny's music possessed public value, while the customs of her class and family made it difficult for her to claim a public identity as a composer. 6 of her songs were published under Felix's name in his collections, and this led to a revealing moment when Queen Victoria met Felix and expressed a desire to sing her favourite of his songs. Felix had to confess that the piece had actually been written by his sister Fanny. And one wonders what Fanny made of that story when it got back to her. And what Queen Victoria made of it. Her confidence began to change during a family journey to Italy between 1839 and 1840. And in Rome, she encountered musicians who responded to her as a composer and pianist in her own right. Among them was the young Charles Gounod. Their serious interest in her work seems to have given her a renewed creative energy. Sometimes a change of place allows us to see ourselves differently. Sometimes we need to enter a new room and meet people who have no investment in keeping us small. The recognition of an informed listener can be transformative. Someone hears the work, looks at the painting or reads the poem and says, quite simply, "This is real." Fanny returned to Berlin carrying the atmosphere and memories of Italy within her. In 1841, she composed Das Jahr, the year, a cycle of 12 piano pieces representing the months, followed by a final postlude. The cycle became a musical journal of time, travel, and memory. Each month possesses its own emotional climate. The year moves through dreams and scherzos, spring songs and serenades, flowing water, gathering darkness, and return. Fanny first presented the work to her husband, the artist Felix Hensel, as a Christmas gift. The couple subsequently created a beautiful manuscript together. Fanny wrote out the music on coloured paper. Wilhelm added illustrations and fragments of poetry accompanied those poetry that accompanied the individual movements. Handwriting and literature were gathered into one intimate work of art. The manuscript is especially moving because it preserves something of their shared creative life. One person's music meets another person's drawings. The passing year becomes visible as well as audible. The movement for August is marked allegro. It arrives with the energy of harvest, vigorous, sunlit and celebratory. Its poetic epigraph comes from Schiller's Song of the Bell. Bright with colour upon the sheaves lies the garland. The music has the feeling of a harvest procession. We hear movement, the labour reaching fruition and the satisfaction of gathering what has been grown. Yet, harvest also carries an awareness of time. To gather something is to recognise that its season of growing has come to an end. And perhaps this is part of the emotional depth of August. Fulfilment and departure exist side by side. The fruit is ripe precisely because the year has moved forward. Fanny herself was also approaching a significant moment of gathering. In 1846, at the age of 40, she made the decision to begin publishing music under her own name. She did so without first seeking Felix's permission. When he learnt of her decision, he sent what he called his professional blessing, although Fanny recognised that he remained uneasy. 7 opus numbers appeared during the final year of her life. There is something deeply poignant in this late claiming of authorship. Fanny had been composing for decades. Her work didn't suddenly become valuable when it entered print. Publication allowed her to place her own name upon what she had created and to allow the music to travel beyond the rooms in which it was born. For women who have delayed a creative ambition, 40 hardly seems late to us now. Yet Fanny had spent more than 20 years being reminded that public authorship belonged to someone else. Her decision carries a quiet courage. It asks us to consider whether some part of our own creative life is still waiting to be given our name. Fanny died suddenly from a stroke in May 1847, aged only 41, while rehearsing one of Felix's compositions for a Sunday concert. Her public life as a published composer had scarcely begun. Today, more than 450 compositions and drafts are associated with her. Her music is increasingly performed, recorded and studied, and she is emerging from the long shadow cast by the fame of her brother. Her story reminds us that creative work may begin in privacy and still deserve to be heard. The quiet room can nurture the work, but it should never become a place in which a woman is expected to disappear. Bernard of Clairvaux and Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel lived in radically different circumstances. One was an abbot whose voice reached across medieval Europe. The other was a woman whose extraordinary musical life unfolded largely within a Berlin home. Yet both understood the need to resist the dispersal of the self. Bernard returned through prayer to the interior place where love could deepen into knowledge. Fanny returned to the keyboard month after month, year after year, giving form to experiences that couldn't be held by ordinary speech. Perhaps this is one of the gifts of creative and spiritual practice. They give us somewhere to return. A piece of music, a poem, a sketchbook, a familiar prayer, or a few minutes of silence can gather us when life has pulled us in too many directions. These practices remind us that we possess an interior life worthy of attention. Caring for it allows us to return to the world with greater presence, generosity, and truth. So as we listen to the year turning through Fanny's music and hear Bernard's warning against losing ourselves in endless occupation, perhaps we might ask, what music, poem, painting, or prayer helps you to return to the part of yourself that daily life so easily disperses? And is there some creative work quietly growing within you that's ready at last to carry your name? Thank you so much for joining me for this week's Wednesday Wandering. Take care. Until next time. Bye-bye.